Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum April 2023 webinar, where we're going to be talking about friendshoring. Before we get started, let me do two things. For those of you who've attended our webinars in the past, we're going to start this one off a little bit differently by having a poll, which I'll launch just now, where we ask you what you think about the made in the world concept, which of course we were all talking about in trade policy. It was a big sort of framing device that Pascal Lamy and others used some time ago. But we're asking you what you think. So please do go ahead and vote in the poll, and we'll talk about this as we go through the webinar. But we're going to be talking about friendshoring today. We've got a great panel. But before we get into it, let me say two words about the Trade Policy Research Forum. My name is Ben Shepherd, along with my colleague Hannah Norberg. I'm one of the co-founders of the forum. Our core business is to do a research webinar about once a month. We've been doing that for over a year and a half now, over 2 years actually. And so what we try and do is to reproduce what people would usually get in a brown bag lunch at a university. And we particularly try and do it with the objective, as you can see from our logo, of building bridges. That is to say, bringing people together from research and practice, from the different parts of the trade policy community, that is to say, economists, lawyers, political scientists, and policy professionals, and also to build a bridge between people in low and middle income countries who may not always have access to things like brown bag lunches, and those in the trade policy global centers like Brussels, Geneva, and Washington, DC, so that we can talk these issues through and get an exchange of opinions. So that's our objective. We're very happy to have you with us. If you'd like to follow us, please check us out on LinkedIn. We have a group of about 1,800 members on LinkedIn. You can post papers, get commentary, and of course, keep up with what we're doing. Please go to our website, tprforum.org, where you can find links to recordings of our previous webinars, and you can also find our mailing list, as well as some additional information on the forum. So that's what we're about. We're really looking forward to the session. So let me hand over to my friend and colleague, Hannah, to introduce it.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. Yes, do head on over to the website. It is brand new, courtesy of Karen and Ricardo. And so today, usually Ben and I, we run these, but today we have the honor of having one of our advisors, Mia, host it for us. And I am excited to see so many people that I know, Anders and Sila and Danielle and David, Elizabeth, and another advisor. Bob Koopman is here. Hey, so good to see everybody. And you who have been here before, you know that this is all about having a conversation. So we really want you to participate. We want you to have your questions in the comments, or in the Q&A, and do add them as we go, because we always run out of time. Always, always, always. We've never had one that was too long yet. So please, so good to see you. So hey, Patrick Snow, I would actually start with people writing in the chat box. Hey, I'm calling in from, so that you understand how the chat box works, and we also get to know you a little bit. And that's so much more fun. And we will, as Ben, for you guys who are just coming in now, Ben, we're trying out a survey today so that we can get some answers as we go. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the esteemed Mia Mikic, our advisor, who is hosting this super exciting event today. Go, Mia.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you very much for this, energizing introduction. I'm very happy to be here, although it is 1 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand. So, if anyone think I will be dozing off, I will not, because I know how these seminars are always engaging and lively. Today, we really have a special seminar or webinar because we have two fantastic speakers One is Emily Benson, and another one is Dan Ciuriak. And I will just read a couple of sentences from their bios. You can find it, of course, on Google or their institutions that they're affiliated with. So Emily Benson is a director of a project on trade and technology and senior fellow of Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she focuses on trade, investment and technology issues, primarily in the transatlantic context. Prior to joining CSIS, she managed transatlantic legislative relations at the European Foundation, focusing on trade relations and emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. And of course, she is active on different medias and produces commentaries that are then picked up by various media like New York Times, Washington Post, etc. She lived in France, Indonesia, and Switzerland, and so it is well, I think, positioned to comment from both sides of Atlantic, but also maybe with some insight from Asia. Then Ciuriak is a long friend and director and principal of Ciuriak Consulting in Ottawa, senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation, a fellow in residence with the C.D. Howe Institute, distinguished fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and associate with BKP Development Research and Consulting in Munich in Germany. His areas of interest and work and research include international trade and finance, innovation and industrial policy, and economic development. And of course, he has produced many papers. He's one of the most productive people I know. I think every time I reach out to him, he has a list of papers, and we will be providing a list also that are related to this topic. As I said, I can go on and on and on for on both of these CVs, but let me turn to the more sort of substantive things here. I also want to thank Hannah and Ben for allowing us to change the format of this webinar and to make it sort of more conversational than it is normally the case. So we hope it will work as an example, and then we can do it in future as well with different other topics. The topic, as said already, is friends making sense of friend shoring. And when we say here friends, we really not only imply Dan and Emily, myself, and the hosts, but also everyone who is participating, because this is the context of the Trade Policy Research Forum. We all work together and we all try to find sort of solution to difficult problems that face international trade and development. So this is about who and what. And let me also just say one thing about myself. And it's not going to be about my bio, but it will be about the fact that I learned about, appreciating benefits of open borders, not from the textbooks, but really from personal experience and being able to cross borders seeking opportunities. And therefore, I really am dedicated to work for removing all the obstacles that are unnecessary, harming, etc., to mobility or movements of goods, services, capital, people, knowledge, technology, etc. That's why that's why maybe it's more difficult for me to not address this topic passionately. I hope not emotionally, but I will try to not speak a lot and let Dan and Emily speak about that. So My first actually question, and as Hannah said, we would like to have it interactive and more like a conversation. So I will start with a few questions, and then please join in from your end and post your questions, or somehow indicate that you have questions that may be adding to what I'm asking of our speakers. So I was going to start with the first question, and Ben said it is based on what Pascal Lamy introduced around, I think it was 2010, when he was talking about interdependency in production in the world. It was at the tail end of the global financial crisis, right? And he was talking about made in the world. And I was going to ask our Dan and Emily what they think about that and what remains still intact from that concept. But I see that that our participants are saying that the concept is still perhaps useful or usable, but in a different world, not in the world that we had in 2010. So let me turn to Dan. Dan, you in one of your papers you did use "make in the world" as an introductory, I think, paragraph. So what do you want to say about this concept of interdependency?
So I think we have to look at the basic statistics first, and the share of trade in relative to global GDP has not fallen. It has kind of flattened out after the period of steep rise during the 1980s, 1990s, and I guess in the first part of the 2000s. But the global value chains and supply chains that were developed in that period remain largely intact. Now, at the firm level, they represent a means of creating economic rents through exploitation of scale economies within the production system relative to sort of an in-house production system where you are limited in scale. And so those efficiencies are still out there to be obtained, and they have been exploited. There's political risk, which is now coming into play, but so far that really hasn't moved the dial, as far as I can tell, on the made in world production system. It's still there. And final point would be from the perspective of, say, Iceland. Okay, you realize immediately that you depend on the global system. The United States is just above Sudan in terms of the least globalized economy, with a trade share of GDP of around 33%. But everyone else has to rely on the global system of production. So we're in there on a basic sort of permanent basis, and we need to make this work.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to add to it from your end? I know that you are dealing with data and as inputs used by firms and intangible outputs, etc. Does that, when you take that into account, do we still talk about making the world? Is it more actually important to have that concept?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And let me kick off by just reacting very quickly to the poll results, which I think are very interesting. If I got this correctly, only 13% of poll respondents suggested that made in the world is alive and well. That contrasts with 27%, quite high, who say it's already forgotten, and 60% that it's still a possibility. And I think that one is pretty interesting, because one observation I've made recently is that even with targeted decoupling, particularly in high-tech sectors, that does not necessarily mean less trade overall. It could just mean that trade looks different. So it's not necessarily going to lead to a reduction in trade flows. What's interesting is that I would have voted for the minority 13% that it is alive and well. If you look at trade data bilaterally between the US and China that came out somewhat inconveniently right around the Balloon Gate incident, bilateral trade has hit an all-time high at about 680 billion in 2022. And if you look at around you, I'm looking at an iPhone that was manufactured all over the world. My suit, same thing there, cotton sourced all over, manufactured in Vietnam. we all are constantly living in a highly globalized world. And I think, Mia, your last question on where technology and data flows fit in is another great example. You're dialing in from New Zealand, Hannah's in Sweden, Ben and I are on the East Coast, Dan's in Canada. This isn't something that would have occurred a couple of years ago. I personally was not a frequent user of Zoom, which sounds outrageous now to even say. But I think what we are seeing at the end of the day is actually an increase in globalization, particularly in the digital and services economy. And I try and keep that in mind when we go back to these doom and gloom forecasts about the future that say we're going to live in a fractured economy with giant walls everywhere and massive price increases. But I'm fairly optimistic that coupled with digitization and a growth in global services that we actually will see a different outcome. And I just will point to one kind of anecdote that I see very frequently here in Washington when we get CEOs of large multinational companies coming through and talking about their policy concerns or their issues, what they're thinking. And if I could just summarize in sort of a tweet size anecdote, what I think they're seeing is that everyone wants to continue doing business in China, but no one wants to testify. What that means is that there is sort of a perceived reputational risk to continuing to do business in China. And this goes back to what Dan is saying, is that geopolitics really have been injected into the international trade discourse in a way that they historically have not been. What that means for trade policy is that the reluctance of the beneficiaries of free trade are less likely to stick their neck out to really advocate for some of the policies that have benefited them over time. That in turn is resulting in a chilled effect of really good trade policy emanating from various levels of the US government here. So I think there's a little bit of a mismatch in where the private sector would like to go and then where the government is going. But if you look at the way bilateral trade data is kind of demonstrating globalization now, consumers and companies are still in the driver's seat. Governments have the ability to say, well, we would like you to start rethinking about reshuffling supply chains. We're going to explore friendshoring, and we can talk about what that means, if anything, in a few minutes. But a government desire to reshuffle is not necessarily going to materialize without input of consumers and the private sector. And I think that's something worth keeping in mind. So let me leave it there for now.
Thank you. Thank you. You have already opened so many other issues. I think we will go back to some of the things that you were saying here, particularly, of course, into the geopolitics tramping over economics in this context. But I wanted to say in this thing, we saw this make in the world as a very useful sort of reminder that perhaps the business and the practices, etc., were going on quicker than what trade rules were also enabling us to see, because at the same time as we were talking about make in the world, everyone was actually reading this and seeing it as make in China, because everyone was coming with the rules of origin that was registering, the last point of assembly. And so this sense of everything being sourced from one end actually came, and I'm skipping over a number of years now, came to realization during COVID, when we all of a sudden, realized that perhaps some of these global value chains that were made based on using the business model of firms maximizing rents and profits, using economies of scale, and using opportunity to be able to actually slice the production and position it in many different locations, that is not necessarily good practice when we have to have a good quickly into our market and without crossing many borders that are closed. So we had that COVID that reminded us that perhaps we have to really look at how goods are produced, particularly essential goods. And if I may turn back to you, Dan, we then started talking about the resilience of supply chains, right? And that was the resilience, as I understood it. It was driven by this geographical distance and complexity of supply chains. Can you comment a little bit more about that?
So, yeah, I mean, like when we talk about a supply chain policy, it's about geography, right? So what we talk about nearshoring obviously is about the distance of supply chains and the complexity of the logistics and getting stuff, to market or to your factories in time. And this is a constant issue for firms who are always looking to, making that trade-off between where is the low-cost production site, how far is it, and how complex is it to get to your own factory. And of course, there's a concept of robustness here. Okay, are you able to absorb a shock and keep on producing? And that can be dealt with through either having multiple locations of supply, maintaining adequate stocks for just-in-time parts and so forth, right? But nearshoring is about basic economics. You can contrast that with reshoring, which has got now a national economic element to it. And you can make a sort of a case that there are sort of benefits like learning by doing and knowledge spillovers and multiplier effects, which can benefit a local economy from recapturing part of the production chain, having it done locally. And there's a trade-off then, okay, between the national benefits which emerge from the spillovers and the private cost, which is that you are almost by definition, you are taking something which was produced abroad at a more efficient basis and bringing it back to a higher cost production site. At the national level, there might be a benefit, and you can make a case for such industrial policies, especially if there are dynamic benefits from learning by doing. Okay, and if there is a relationship between innovation and actually doing. In other words, this is an issue that has been, I think, prominent in U.S. discussion, because by virtue of the fact that the chip production had largely moved to Asia, the U.S. wasn't getting the benefit of that kind of knowledge development from actually doing things. So those are distinct concepts: reshoring versus nearshoring, even though they're both geographic. And friendshoring is very clearly distinct in that it now introduces a political or geopolitical element, in that you don't want your supply chain potentially to cross a geopolitical fault line. And at a time of rising geopolitical tension, any such supply chain crossing a geopolitical fault line can be subject to weaponization. And where we're seeing this particularly prominently discussed is with regard to rare earth elements, which are critical inputs into various high-tech applications. And of course, the concentration of rare earth production in China puts the production in the West at potential risk. China did at one point try to weaponize rare earths vis-a-vis Japan. And Japan, of course, immediately then put production into place in Mongolia. And of course, rare earths are not rare. They're all over the place. It's just that production has evolved within China. So these are very distinct concepts in terms of what the motivation for supply chain policy is. And we have to always remember that there's going to be economic trade-offs. The more heavily you put the emphasis on the political risk factor, the greater the economic cost you are likely to be incurring in terms of reorganizing supply chains. So resilience, I think, is a really quite different concept. It's about, so you take a hit, how quickly can you get back up and running? And that's, if it's a factory that's hit by, an earthquake or a flood, it's about maintaining the capacity to repair and restore. It's about also maintaining, sort of alternative sites so that you can quickly ramp up production in an alternative site, which in turn is closely related to the concept of flexibility, of supply chain flexibility, because if you have redundant sources of supply, you are more flexible by definition in how you can respond, but also then you're in a position to more easily ramp up and ramp down supply as demand fluctuates. So I think we have to keep a clear distinction between what we're talking about and what's really driving things today is, of course, geopolitical risk. I'll leave it there.
It is. Thank you. Thank you very much for mentioning all these terms, and let me repeat them because you know, we at the same time we have people here that are also researching and may want to add their results in a chat or ask a question. So we were mentioning about resilience, about robustness, about flexibility. I think also adaptability in that context, and all of these sit at different levels actually of the management of supply chains. And what also is different is that all of these used to be just at the, you know, at the mind of managers of supply chains, not governments, right? Because the firms were making decisions about where to produce, where to source from, where to, you know, sell, and how complex or not these will be based on, of course, economic and fundamentals, right? And so now all of a sudden you drop into this spin, geopolitics, but it's in a particular sense that I want to actually open it and to bring in one research from I think it was University of Texas, Nitya Nayar and her co-authors, where they showed that in India during COVID, the more complex supply chains, and they were talking about national supply chains, to be honest, the more complex they were, the more resilient in a sense of recovery and ability to, or more even robustness was in the place, right? And the factor contributing to that was trust that was built in into the supply chain because of that complexity and dependency between the actors or the nodes in the supply chain. So Emily, now I think when we talk about friendshoring and replacement of geographical distance with the political distance, and we want to have the supply chains being located in the countries that are politically closed to us, that is often interpreted as the countries that we trust. Can you comment on that in a sense of, you know, how close are these concepts, and what are the elements of trust applied to the countries that we can use here that can be used by firms as well?
Yeah, thank you, Mia. That's a very good question. And I think there is a difference between resiliency, which I will much more crudely define than Dan, as not putting all of your eggs in one basket. That in turn begs the question of, well, where do you put your eggs if you're getting out of one basket? And that's really where we are right now, is admiring the problem, if you will, of trying to figure out where to reshuffle. Where do we trust? What's a friend? If you go back a couple of years ago, 2 summers ago, when the Biden administration was just kind of ramping up after settling into office, the term that preceded friendshoring was ally shoring. And critics of the concept of ally shoring pointed out that an ally would be a much smaller group of countries, one with whom the United States has a very close military relationship. So that would have precluded a large number of additional countries from participating more robustly in these supply chain discussions. What that means today is it's still on the government to determine who is a friend and who is not. I'm a little bit suspicious of the term friend shoring because I think that there is a certain element that goes beyond trust, and that is availability of assets in critical sectors that other countries need for production. So it's a nice concept to say, okay, we're broadly aligned, we're broadly democratic. I think there are a lot of exceptions there. But the real driver here is who has the inputs needed and this is particularly acute in high-tech sectors and then in the green transition. Lithium comes to mind, obviously, but other commodities like copper. And so it's really about building a structure to figure out who has what and how to get it here. And whether or not that ultimately materializes, I think, is up to, again, buy-in from the private sector. I actually was talking to someone about 1.5 years ago who runs a small 5-person shop in Southern California that depends on a lot of aluminum inputs for his business. And I asked, well, what do you think about nearshoring, friendshoring? What do you make of all of this? And he said, to be totally frank, I've been doing business in China for 20 years, and it's not really viable for me to just turn around and have a new business set up somewhere. I would like to do business in Mexico. It makes sense, like Dan was saying, from a supply chain logistics perspective, where it's physically closer. You know that you can get the goods in a shorter amount of time and that it will not be susceptible in the same way to shutdowns related to COVID or other disruptions, including a climate event that would disrupt shipping supply chains, for example. However, he could not locate a viable business alternative in Mexico because there was no commercial service diplomat that could actually facilitate the deal or put him in contact with people who were willing to fill in this demand that he had. And that speaks to a broader problem, is if the governments are seeking this policy of friendshoring, it really does fall on them, particularly commercial diplomats, to make sure that viable alternatives happen. It is an unreasonable request to think that the private sector should A, identify geopolitical risk in its entirety, B, define national security, and C, know when it's time to move out of a market. If that is government-led, then that's on the government to identify friends. And I think right now the clearest way to identify friends is through a process of elimination. And this emerged quite a bit in the last couple of years, particularly during the CHIPS and Science Act legislative discussions about countries of concern. And this is interesting as well, because Venezuela was ultimately omitted from the list of countries of concern, but it was initially included. And so in a 6-month time frame, you can have a country join the list, fall off the list, go into sort of the ether of no one really knows how friendly they are. And so moving forward, it will be on us and governments to really come up with a more definitive framework for analyzing the entire concept of friendshoring.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And I think what you in the explanation that you provided, you also mentioned that, you know, if governments want that to happen, they will have to do something about that. And this is, I want to talk about these next, exactly what they have to do about it, and the instruments they can use in terms of economic policies to make it happen. And so we know then that you know, the one of the primary instrument that is already being discussed for you know, earlier, but particularly since this shift, are subsidies, right? But also the export restrictions and bans, etc. Can you comment on the different impacts of these policies as opposed to the policies that were used in the early era of making the world phase of production, where we actually strive to liberalize and to remove barriers rather than to insert them? Then?
So I would draw a distinction between sort of the areas where there are significant economic rents and the areas where there are not. Okay, so if you were to look back in the 1980s and 1990s, when we were building global supply chains and value chains, the Global Factory was a book published in 1985. So this was early on. Nonetheless, in areas where there were significant economic rents, increasing returns to scale, like civilian aircraft, like dynamic random access memory chips, you still had all the tools of geoeconomic conflict used to try and capture those rents. We had decades-long wars, trade wars between Boeing and Airbus, Bombardier and Embraer, and of course in the chip sector. So that has never gone away. It was always there even when we were building global supply chains. And of course now that particular economic sort of contest is centered over computer chips and the data systems for developing artificial intelligence. That's inevitable. There's just too much money at stake for countries not to weigh in and say, we want to capture that. So we can hive that off and say this was inevitable, but then we do need to try and contain this. As was said in American Chamber of Commerce presentation in Ottawa the other week, we don't want to have this kind of stuff spill over into, burgers and baseball caps, where there are no strategic sort of issues, or aluminum bits that go into some, apparatus which a manufacturer in California is making. So the problem that we have right now is that the bilateral relationship, political relationship between the United States and China has gotten out of hand and is spilling over into everything. You even have, for example, baseball caps being brought into discussion because, the made in a Make America Great cap was made in China, and that kind of becomes a football. So my basic point would be that in the areas where there are rents, you will have this contest. In areas where the global economy is competitive and there are no rents, this should be left to the private sector with minimal intervention. Now, within that sort of competitive part of the world of the production system, there are still critical supplies like face masks. There are still critical supplies like even sort of basic minerals and whatnot, which go into production. Even though there aren't huge rents there is still political risk if this could be weaponized. So, you can't entirely leave this to the private sector. There may be public sector rationales for maintaining either large strategic stocks or minimal production capacity at home. But once you get into something like maintaining minimal production capacity, okay, and this was found in the States actually during the pandemic when face masks were in shortage, and there was I recall a manufacturer in Texas, and his problem was that if he actually put in place the capacity to produce face masks for the United States immediate needs, within months, he would have excess capacity, which would not be viable. And then immediately you get the turn to protection and subsidies. So once you get public sector considerations flowing into the construction of these or into the organization of supply chains, you immediately have to confront the fact that you may have to subsidize, you may have to have public labs for things like, for example, vaccine production. Canada used to have Connaught Labs, which was a vaccine producer. It was a public lab, and we had the capacity then to actually, in a pinch, ramp up production of vaccines, such as were needed for COVID. But by virtue of the fact that we let Connaught Labs go, we didn't have that capacity. Okay, and then we were in a situation where we were waiting in line for whichever producer globally would be able to produce for us. So that's a public consideration, which then may require both a capital investment to either relocate or to create a supply capacity, at least at a certain minimum level nationally. And then, of course, the ongoing subsidy, because you are also facing variable costs, which are likely higher than they would be globally. So that's a policy decision, and it should be funded. And there's not a heck of a lot of complexity sort of in thinking about that. And once you get into the subsidy game, of course, you've got rent seeking and blah blah blah, and we all know that. So it's very difficult to manage. So you really do want to minimize that, but you may have to have in certain areas that sort of public capacity. I would actually recommend in that case Canada's approach, which always has been, if you need something like that, have a crown corporation.
Exactly. I think that was one of the, and I thought I was a lonely soul in saying that, but thank you for mentioning that. I almost didn't dare to do so. I think there is a great role for government to actually run public health and similar sectors as government should, rather than the private companies based on a profit. And so they cannot transfer that task to the private company and suffer the losses as was the case in early stages in the pandemic. I think Ben has a question. Ben?
Yeah, thanks, Mia. This has been a great conversation. So what I'd like to do is jump in with a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A. And it's two questions, but I'm going to put them together into one. And let me direct it to Emily first, but I'm sure, Dan, you'll want to come in as well. So, when we think about something like friendshoring, nearshoring, even reshoring, we think about it in terms of costs and benefits. How well advanced are we in terms of understanding what those costs and benefits are, given that, the benefits in a certain sense are intangible? They're about relationships, they're about politics, they're about strategy, whereas the costs are something that we're very good at measuring. So, going back to the experiences Dan was talking about with civil aircraft and DRAMs and all these other sorts of things, we can measure exactly how much the impact is going to be on consumers and businesses if we use active trade policies in a way that increases sourcing prices. So, part one of the question is, how do we go about sort of reconciling these different benefits and costs? And then part two of the question is from the perspective of managing relationships. We've been talking about this, I think, from the perspective of the countries that want to engage in friendshoring, so specifically the United States. What about guys on the outside? So particularly if we think about countries in Southeast Asia, where they straddle a bridge. They have good relationships in general with the United States, but they also have to, because of their geography, maintain important relationships with China. So how do we manage all of that? And if we change perspective for a second, what can countries in a region like Southeast Asia do to try and confront the challenges that this is going to put in front of them? So, Emily, do you have some thoughts on those questions?
Sure, thank you. Great questions. In terms of costs and benefits, I may have a little bit different of a view on the benefits being intangible. I think that's true to a degree, but if you look at US military strategy in the Indo-Pacific, for example, it is very tangible. And when we talk about a friend, what the United States means is, well, they let us put a base there. And so I think that's something that's worth keeping in mind over time. The other element that I would bring in is something I alluded to earlier, which is, to me, friendshoring is essentially, at the end, who has what you need. And this goes back to a lot of the inputs that Indonesia has, or that Chile and Argentina have. So it's about building those relationships so that you can extract for your own supply chain and domestic production capabilities. That to me is all very measurable. And so we will be able to see in 10 years, for example, where that succeeded and where it did not succeed. How far along are we in actually determining whether or not friendshoring is succeeding? I think it's far too early to tell, because we're just now talking about friendshoring. If you look at the Inflation Reduction Act, a lot of the funds haven't been deployed. If you look at export controls, for example, there are probably several tranches of controls that are forthcoming on additional emerging technologies that could reshuffle things as well. And so it's just too early to tell. And I think we'll need several more years to be able to discern the true effects. In terms of your relationship question and where third countries come in, that to me is probably the most important element here in the administration, at least in the US, their approach to trade. If I could just zoom out for 1 second and think about what constitutes the commercial strategy of the administration, I would put it into 2 buckets. One is to pull, and that's via these investments and industrial strategies, pull investment in. And the other is to push companies out of China. And that's contained in the export controls. And then, of course, the forthcoming executive order that will screen outbound investments into national security critical sectors in China, like AI, semiconductors, and quantum technology. So you have the push and the pull. But as I understand it, those two haven't sufficiently communicated with each other. There creates this opening to build a bridge between the two. And that's really where third countries come in, is creating a space where they can fill some of the demand in a way that does not put them in a public situation of having to take a side amid rising tensions between China and the United States. The US is trying to do this via the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and its Latin American equivalent, the APEP. But those, Mia, going back to your original question about more traditional trade instruments, those do not contain market access provisions or tariff liberalization measures. They look very different. As I understand it, the IPEF main outcome in the next couple of months will be on basically information sharing for critical supply chain warning systems, these early alert warnings. These are designed with COVID in mind, obviously, but I think they will come to be used in other crises, potentially a geopolitical one or a climate change driven crisis. To what degree these new instruments will function or whether or not they'll have a trade liberalizing effect over time that looks like standards also remains to be seen. And so it's really on us to make sure that we make this policy succeed to the degree that that's possible.
Dan,
Thanks,
do you
Emily.
want to add something to that?
So I think that was a very good sort of explanation. So I don't have an awful lot to say there. One thing I would mention generally is that if you look at where American foreign and economic policy work together well historically, and in America, I mean, I think Emily will agree, economic policy was always subordinate to foreign policy. But it worked really well on the Pacific Rim. You know, Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, and even down into Southeast Asia were brought into the global system of production partly because, largely perhaps because they were a bulwark against, you know, communist China back in the day. China became a tacit ally of the States after Deng Xiaoping's visit to Washington in '79, and that led to a 40-year period where, notwithstanding bumps in the road here and there was a natural symbiosis between the two. As America was moving into the knowledge-based economy after 1980, it was shedding industrial tasks, and China was learning by doing, by picking those tasks up. It was very, very lucrative for both economies, and it underpinned China's development, massive improvement in human welfare as a result, but it also enabled the United States to ride ahead to its unipolar moment. Okay, so now after you get into the 2010 and on period, now China is actually moving into the knowledge-based sphere big time, which is now going head to head with the United States in terms of the patenting and so forth, and also into the data economy. And that's where you get the, now the conflicts starting to emerge. But in that period when America was basically containing China, it was actually very, very supportive of economic development on the Pacific Rim. And the same was true with Western Europe, where the United States was actually making compromises on things like agricultural policy in order to have a strong Europe as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. Where American foreign policy and economics did not work well was in Africa and in South America. The Monroe Doctrine zone is not a healthy economy, and Africa never prospered either. And that's because you didn't have those kinds of dynamics where by the United States had a strong political motive for ensuring prosperity. It was rather extractive. Okay, so I think in terms of the as the future unfolds now, the areas where America was primarily extractive are the places that are looking to China now, okay, for economic development. And now those chickens are coming home to roost here, and this is going to be a major political challenge for going forward. So as we think about friendshoring, I think we should think about the long-term consequences of how we interact with friends, and it should be constructive. And by the way, as a final comment, I would take it back to the NAFTA. NAFTA was originally conceived. You listen to people like Jeff Shaw and Gary Hufbauer in their testimony to Congress. It was about bringing back activity into North America, into Mexico, okay? And so that concept of having a trade deficit with Mexico, which would be good for Mexican development, stood on its head in the Trump era as, the great sucking sound of American jobs going down to Mexico. It was actually the great sucking sound of jobs going from East Asia into Mexico, which was the objective of NAFTA. Okay, so our narratives are important, and our concepts about sort of what the implications of friendshoring are, especially in terms of building strong, positive win-win trade networks within the friend zone, are very important.
Thank you very much for that. We are left only with 8 minutes, and there are things that I think we need to mention. One, and thank you, Bob and others, for putting in chat the links to the most recent research dealing with the economic cost of the French shoring, let me use that term. And maybe, Ben, you can put the second poll now, because we want to relate, to the different notions of what is going on. Is it decoupling, de-risking, deglobalization, rivalry, or what it is going on? And different sort of understanding of what is going on will impact our approach to how do we calculate these costs. And yes, we have, for example, the IMF has calculated the cost based on defragmentation of foreign direct investment. We have gotten some modeling that is based on really mimicking friendshoring by putting countries grouped together with respect how they vote in GA, and then see how the strengthening of economic relations between them would impact a global economy. We have early research from the WTO looking at what would be the global GDP impact of the fragmentation, etc. And these come in between 5 and 12% of the global GDP, and Dan has also can speak more about his efforts in terms of calculating these costs. So we do have some sense of these costs, but it also, I think, would be important to understand the longer term costs in terms of systemic changes and the impacts of this, if we understand it as fragmentation or bifurcation on the availability of having rules-based system as compared to the power-based system. So I want you to comment on these things, and then also wrap in the question that we have in the column here, and this is about the increasing sort of seeping in of non-economic objectives in the country's economic relations with the other countries, right? And this comes not necessarily from the governments. This can come from consumers, and from the we do have pressure from consumers with respect to human rights, environment, and other non-economic objectives. And how will this be fit into this friendshoring and the high level geopolitical considerations. So whoever wants to go first on these things. And we have results here as well on everyone is this the result that de-risking is 48%? Is this because we have most people sitting in from Europe and going along with the European concept, or is it something else? I don't know. All right.
Sure, I'm happy to start.
Yeah, please.
I think it's interesting to pose the question about de-risking versus rivalry. I would need to tease that out a little bit more. I think that would be a fantastic paper that maybe someone on this call would be interested in writing. When we think about transatlantic trade in particular, I think there's a tendency in the trade community to overascribe the pursuit of decoupling to the United States. It's pretty clear that that's not occurring wholesale and that the US government does not want to usher in a total period of decoupling. What that means basically is that the United States is already much closer to what President von der Leyen said recently, which is that if we're not decoupling, we are de-risking. What I think is a more interesting question potentially is whether or not attempts to de-risk are a feature of a growing rivalry between China and the United States. It's also interesting to what degree Western or techno-democratic allied economies are de-risking and what China is also pursuing to de-risk. They're trying to indigenize a lot of their advanced semiconductor nodes. There was one example last summer where they appear to have been able to produce, probably not at scale, but 7-nanometer semiconductors. That for them is part of self-sufficiency and part of an inherent de-risking strategy. I think the same is true for the United States. We are trying to encourage de-risking via friendshoring, but whether or not we're in a full-on rivalry right now between the economies seems less likely. So my vote would have been for de-risking, but Dan, I don't know if you have additional thoughts or if you disagree.
No, I mean, it's de-risking is kind of an amalgam of the sort of friendshoring issue where you take into account the geopolitical divide, but also simply the natural risk management that firms have to apply as a matter of course regarding sort of their, maintaining a robust, resilient supply chains. It kind of combines them. And I'm not sure exactly how I would parse that out. I think in terms of the, the area where we are seeing, of course, the major conflict is, as Emily was saying, is on computer chips. And we're now like 5 years into this. I mean, this really started out in 2018 when Huawei stole a march on the West in terms of getting 5G systems in place. And the counter sort of initiative was launched. Huawei, of course, was knocked out of first place in cell phone manufacturing, which is hardly strategic. But it has, in the last 5 years, been the #1 firm in patenting. Okay, and it is creating, freedom to operate, FTO. If you're not familiar with that term, it is basically building up a patent portfolio that gives you the ability to operate globally. Now, this is important because when you build up FTO in that fashion, you are aiming at global markets. This is not about producing for China. This is producing for Europe and producing for North America and for the rest of the world on a WTO basis. Okay, so they're anticipating that they will have the protected intellectual property rights to be active in these areas. And China is building up FTO like crazy right now. So they're playing the game that was invented in the United States in the 1980s and copied by Western Europe. So in terms of how far then de-risking goes, I mean, if the Chinese suppliers are fully active in the West with their own protected IP, And in terms of like, we're 5 years in, they still haven't got the lithography in place. They still haven't got down the chip production down, I think on a scale basis, even to 14 nanometers. I think the 28 nanometers is where they're still basically producing. But 5 more years and they will be there. I mean, this takes 2 or 3 years to get down sort of a generation of capability. So where are we going to be in 2030 on this, right? Where China does have the capacity and they've got the size of the market. And by virtue of the fact that we are restricting our own firms from selling into China, they will be losing the revenues from that, which then go into R&D. I can tell you ASML in the Netherlands is scared shitless what it is. They see this, even though they've got the world-leading lithography capability right now, the Chinese competition is coming and it will be there in due course. So I think again, the rivalry is going to be there as long as the rents are there. What we have to do is to limit the political hostility, because believe you me, I mean, Ren, the leader of Huawei, he's a military guy and he's being kneecapped, right? What happens when he's got a chance to kneecap you? So there is a very complex sort of issue about whether de-risking actually means taking on long-term risk of retaliation. So yeah, very, very complex geopolitical consideration. I think, where this is a long game, a repeat game, and we have to have that in mind.
Thank you, Dan. And I agree also with what Bob is saying in the chat. It's important to look forward. And so, Ben, maybe we can put the last poll question, and because we also have to close up now. We want to look forward. I did ask my speakers to think about the closing sentence about the future, and I would ask them also to combine it with perhaps some recommendations about where research looking into future should be going, because this is a research community and we want to provide some ideas to our participants about where they should be focusing on. So shall we start with Emily and then end with Dan?
Sure. For that last question, tend to think that trade will be increasingly weaponized over time. If you look at the growing injection of economic security, international security, and vice versa, that is unlikely to change with a change in administration in the United States, whether or not Democrats or Republicans are in power. The one uniting policy right now is really taking a tough stance on China. Whether or not that's misguided is a separate discussion, but I think that's a feature of American political discourse that will not dissipate in the next administration. What that means is additional export controls, additional investment screening, coupled with industrial policy that's trying to reshuffle primarily green and strategic supply chains. So I foresee a period of increased weaponization of trade policy. Where I think the interesting nexus in trade research really gets at all of that, and that is the costs of export controls. Dalip Singh gave a speech a couple of days ago here in Washington. He was sort of the sanctions czar at the White House National Security Council before departing last year. And he really lamented the lack of a clear strategic guidance document for the administration. And I think that speaks to a more persistent problem in the US, which is that the institutional design of our government precludes the development of one big policy document that says, here's the agenda, here's the goal, here's how we can go about actually effectuating the objectives. Absent that, I think we need to do far more research on what the economic impacts and geopolitical impacts of export controls are. It's very easy to say that with the recent trilateral arrangement between the Netherlands and the Japanese, that there were clear benefits for engaging those countries. There are also very significant drawbacks. And I think some of the drawbacks have far-reaching consequences on where third countries sit. A lot of countries do not want to be subject to extraterritorial trade actions by the United States. So if we can build a data story and a compelling economic analysis of why those policies are harmful and how we can mitigate some risk in geopolitical terms while also minimizing economic impact, that to me would be very worthwhile. So thank you again for hosting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Dan?
So I think that an area where we really need to do, it's not so much research, but it's a lot of work on formulating the narrative. I'll give you a couple of simple examples. One is that, the combined market share of the United States, Germany, and Japan in manufacturing is greater than that of China, with 1/3 the population. So we have 3 times the intensity of manufacturing that China does on a per capita basis. We still know how to make things in the West. That is not the perspective, the fear factor that's being injected into the narrative to justify potentially industrial policies that don't really make sense. So that's one factor. A second one, in 2021, China passed the United States as the leading buyer of intellectual property in the world. Their payments for intellectual property surpassed that of the United States. And there's been a huge steep growth in that particular purchase. We still have a narrative that somehow China primarily steals technology. They don't. Apart from the fact that they're by far now the world's leading patenter, and they're now they're growing their international IP receipts at like a 30% compound annual growth rate, okay, based upon the technology that they've developed and patented over the past decade or so. They're in a different space now. We need to change that narrative. There are many, many other areas where the China narrative just doesn't match the reality. But the problem is the hostility that's being generated is now starting to come back. If you were following China on Twitter 4 years ago or 6 years ago, when the Trump administration was really starting, they hired Western ad agencies to, have cutesy advertisements poking fun back at the Americans. That switched to Wolf Warrior, and in the last year or so, that has switched into outright militaristic hostility. I mean, so there's an escalating factor here that is really, really unhealthy. And in part, what we need to do in the West is to actually get at that narrative, and where it's not sort of particularly accurate, counter it and change that, and work towards finding a modus vivendi with China, because China's not going to go away. And believe me, the West is also not going to collapse either. So, where are we going to be in 2030? Well, call me 2030.
Thank you, Dan. Look, we are way over time, so I'm not going to even attempt to provide any summary of this. I think it was fantastic discussion. Thank you, Dan and Emily, and contributors to the chat and to the questions, and my hosts. I think we have added a little bit more of understanding to the questions. Of course, it is ongoing area of debate, discussion, deliberation, and I'm sure we will be revisiting bits and pieces of that as we move forward. So thank you very much, Ben and Hannah, for giving us the opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both Emily and Dan. I really learned so much from this discussion. And of course, a huge thank you to Mia. Mia is on our board of advisors for TPRF, so she's really instrumental in how we're trying to keep the forum going and build it up over time. So we really appreciate your presence here today, even as it gets on now past 2 in the morning, I think, in New Zealand. So we really appreciate you doing that. So again, thanks for a fantastic session. As I said, our core business is a monthly webinar, so we will be back in a month's time. On May 25th, we'll have Claire Delperche from OECD, who'll be talking to us about new developments in fisheries trade. So this is an area where there's a WTO agreement on subsidies. So we're going to be talking subsidies and all that sort of stuff in a completely different context. Thanks again to Mia for chairing, my co-host Hannah, our 2 speakers, and to everyone for actively participating in all of the polls, the Q&A and the chat. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you back here in a month's time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. And this will be posted, this recording will be posted on the website coming up pretty soon. So for those of you who, want an encore, or those who came in late, or, whatever, we aim to please, right? Fantastic insight. Thank you so much, everybody. See you in a month. TPRforum.com, TPRforum.com. The question about what website? Our website. And also hop into the LinkedIn group and continue the conversations, as always. And let us know if there's something specific that you want us to cover. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Pleasure to meet
Thank
you,
you.
Emily. Thanks.